At 12:42 p.m. on July 20th, 1944, an explosion ripped through the wooden conference barracks at the Wolf's Lair, sending splinters, maps, and human bodies flying through the shattered windows. Adolf Hitler, standing just 6 feet from a briefcase containing 2 pounds of British plastic explosive, should have died instantly. He did not. And in the hours that followed, as the Führer's shock transformed into volcanic rage, he would discover that the men who had sworn sacred oaths to protect him, his own generals, the elite of the German officer corps, had been planning his murder for years. The morning of July 20th, 1944, began unremarkably at the Wolfschanze, Hitler's eastern headquarters hidden deep in the Masurian forests of East Prussia. The compound, a sprawling complex of reinforced concrete bunkers and wooden barracks surrounded by minefields and SS checkpoints, had been Hitler's primary residence for most of the war. The air was humid, heavy with the scent of pine, and the usual tension that pervaded the headquarters had intensified in recent weeks, as the military situation deteriorated on all fronts. Hitler had risen late, around 10 a.m., as was his habit. He had spent the previous evening in one of his interminable monologues, lecturing his inner circle until nearly 3 a.m. about the treachery of the aristocratic officer class, the incompetence of his generals, the coming miracle weapons that would reverse Germany's fortunes. His valet, Heinz Linger, noted that the Führer seemed more agitated than usual, complaining of headaches and digestive troubles that had plagued him for months. The midday situation conference was scheduled for 12:30 p.m., but had been moved forward to 12:30 due to a visit expected from Benito Mussolini that afternoon. This seemingly minor schedule change would prove fateful. Present in the conference room were approximately 20 officers and staff, including Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the Armed Forces High Command, Colonel General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations, General Walter Warlimont, Deputy Chief of Operations, and numerous adjutants, stenographers, and liaison officers. At 12:35 p.m., Colonel Klaus Schenk Graf von Stauffenberg arrived at the conference barracks. Stauffenberg was a striking figure even among the decorated officers of the Wehrmacht. Tall, handsome, bearing the terrible wounds of combat in North Africa, where he had lost his right hand, 2 fingers of his left hand, and his left eye to a strafing attack. He walked with the aid of a cane, his empty sleeve pinned to his uniform, a living symbol of sacrifice for the Reich. What no one in that room knew was that Stauffenberg had spent the morning in a desperate struggle to arm a bomb concealed in his briefcase. In a nearby hut, using his remaining 3 fingers and a pair of specially modified pliers, he had managed to activate one of 2 explosive charges. He had intended to use both, but an interruption by a sergeant had forced him to proceed with only half the planned explosive power. Stauffenberg entered the conference room and was introduced to Hitler, who acknowledged him with a brief nod. The colonel placed his briefcase under the heavy oak map table, positioning it as close to Hitler as possible, approximately 6 feet from where the Führer stood, leaning over maps of the Eastern Front where Army Group Center had just suffered catastrophic defeat. At 12:40 p.m., Stauffenberg excused himself, claiming he needed to make an urgent telephone call to Berlin. No one questioned the one-eyed colonel as he walked out of the barracks, his pace steady despite the knowledge that in minutes the briefcase he had left behind would detonate. What Stauffenberg could not know was that Colonel Heinz Brandt, seeking more room at the crowded table, had pushed the briefcase with his foot, moving it to the far side of the heavy oak table support. This thick wooden beam would absorb much of the blast that was meant to kill Hitler. At 12:42 p.m., the bomb exploded. The detonation was heard throughout the compound. A massive column of smoke and debris erupted from the conference barracks. Bodies were thrown through windows. The roof partially collapsed. Stauffenberg, watching from approximately 200 meters away, saw the destruction and was convinced no one inside could have survived. He hurried to his waiting car, bluffed his way through 3 security checkpoints with extraordinary nerve, and reached the airfield where a Heinkel He-111 waited to fly him to Berlin. As Stauffenberg's aircraft climbed into the summer sky, he believed Adolf Hitler was dead. Operation Valkyrie, the military coup planned for years by a network of anti-Nazi officers, was now in motion. Reserve army units in Berlin, Vienna, Paris and Prague would seize control, arrest SS and Gestapo leaders, and establish a new government that would seek peace with the Western Allies. But Hitler was not dead. The explosion that should have ended the war in July 1944 instead unleashed a reign of terror that would claim thousands of lives. But how did Hitler survive? And what happened when he discovered that his most trusted officers had betrayed him? The answer reveals one of the darkest chapters of the Third Reich. The blast had killed 4 men outright and wounded nearly everyone else in the room. Colonel Brandt, who had unknowingly moved the briefcase, would die of his injuries 2 days later. General Rudolf Schmundt, Hitler's chief adjutant, suffered wounds that would prove fatal. General Günther Korten, Luftwaffe Chief of Staff, was mortally wounded. Stenographer Heinrich Berger died at the scene. Hitler himself emerged from the smoke and debris in a state that witnesses would later describe as miraculous. His hair was singed, his eardrums ruptured, his right arm temporarily paralyzed. His trousers had been shredded by the blast, hanging in tatters. Wooden splinters had peppered his legs with over 100 small wounds. But he was alive, walking, conscious, and within minutes, consumed by a rage that those who witnessed it would never forget. Field Marshal Keitel, himself wounded but mobile, found Hitler stumbling through the wreckage. The Führer's first coherent words, according to multiple witnesses, were, "Someone tried to kill me." By 1 p.m., Hitler had been examined by his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, and moved to his personal bunker. His injuries, while painful, were not life-threatening. The ruptured eardrums would cause hearing problems for weeks. The arm paralysis would fade within days. The psychological wounds, however, would prove permanent. At 1:15 p.m., the first reports began arriving that pointed toward the truth. Stauffenberg had left the conference immediately before the explosion. He had been seen hurrying to a car. He had flown to Berlin. Communications officer Lieutenant General Erich Feldgiebel, himself a conspirator, had attempted to cut communications from the Wolf's Lair, but the system was too decentralized to be completely disabled. Hitler received these reports in his bunker, Dr. Morell applying bandages to his wounds, his uniform being replaced. Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler was summoned immediately. So was Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. The Führer's inner circle began gathering, their faces showing shock, confusion, and in some cases poorly concealed fear. At approximately 2 p.m., Hitler learned that Operation Valkyrie orders had been issued in Berlin. Reserve army units were mobilizing. The commandant of the Berlin garrison had received orders to arrest SS leaders. Something far larger than a lone assassination attempt was underway. The moment of full recognition came at 3:30 p.m., when intercepted communications revealed the scope of the conspiracy. This was not the act of a single disgruntled officer. This was a coordinated military coup involving senior generals, staff officers, and administrators across the Reich. Names began to emerge. Colonel General Ludwig Beck, former chief of the General Staff who was to become head of state. Colonel General Erich Höppner, dismissed in 1942, who was to command the Home Army. Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, who was to become Supreme Commander of the Wehrmacht. Hitler sat in silence as the names were read to him. Keitel, standing nearby, later described the Führer's face as white as chalk, then flushing red, his hands trembling. When the briefing concluded, Hitler spoke in a voice so low that those present had to lean forward to hear. "I have always known," he said, "that the officer corps was riddled with traitors. The Prussian aristocrats, the General Staff clique, they have never accepted me. They have sabotaged my orders, lied about their failures, blamed me for their incompetence, and now this." He rose abruptly, his injured arm hanging limply. "But they have failed. Providence has protected me. This is proof that I am destined to complete my mission, and I will have my revenge. In Berlin, the conspirators were operating on the assumption that Hitler was dead. Stauffenberg had landed at Rangsdorf airfield at 3:45 p.m. and raced to the Bendler block, the War Ministry headquarters on Bendlerstrasse, where General Friedrich Olbricht had already begun mobilizing reserve army units. But the conspiracy was plagued by hesitation and confusion. General Friedrich Fromm, commander of the reserve army, and a man who had known of the plot but refused to actively participate, now learned that Hitler had survived. Fromm immediately attempted to distance himself from the conspirators, ordering their arrest. A physical struggle ensued in Fromm's office, during which Stauffenberg was shot in the arm. The conspirators managed to overpower Fromm and lock him in an adjoining room, but the delay proved fatal. Phone calls between Berlin and the Wolf's Lair had revealed that Hitler was alive. Officers who had been prepared to follow Valkyrie orders now hesitated. The momentum that might have carried the coup to success evaporated in a cascade of countermanded orders and shifting loyalties. At 6:30 p.m., Hitler made a radio address from the Wolf's Lair, his voice hoarse but unmistakable, describing a very small clique of ambitious, wicked and stupidly criminal officers who had attempted to kill him. The broadcast shattered any remaining hope for the conspirators. Reserve army units that had been mobilizing now stood down or actively turned against the plotters. At the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's rage was building toward an explosion that would dwarf the one that had nearly killed him. He summoned SS Gruppenführer Heinrich Müller, chief of the Gestapo, and issued orders that would unleash a reign of terror unprecedented even by Nazi standards. "I want them all," Hitler declared. "Every officer who knew of this plot, everyone who failed to report it, every family member, every friend. I want them found, I want them arrested, and I want them destroyed." The failed assassination attempt on July 20th triggered the deadliest purge in German military history. Over 7,000 people would be arrested. Nearly 5,000 would be executed. But the conspiracy ran deeper than even Hitler imagined, and the investigations that followed would reveal just how close Germany's generals had come to ending the war nearly a year before its catastrophic conclusion. The end came swiftly for the Berlin conspirators. By 11 p.m. on July 20th, loyal officers led by Major Otto Ernst Riemer had surrounded the Bendler block. General Fromm, freed from his imprisonment, moved quickly to eliminate witnesses to his own complicity. He convened an impromptu court-martial and sentenced Stauffenberg, Olbricht's chief of staff, Colonel Albrecht Merz von Quernheim, and Lieutenant Werner von Heften to immediate execution. Shortly after midnight, the four men were led into the courtyard of the Bendler block. The building's facade was illuminated by the headlights of military vehicles. Stauffenberg, his arm still bleeding from the earlier gunshot, faced the firing squad with composure. His last words, shouted as the rifles were raised, were, "Long live sacred Germany!" Colonel General Beck, who had been designated to lead the new government, was offered the opportunity to take his own life. His first attempt failed. The pistol merely grazed his head. A sergeant was ordered to administer the coup de grace. The days and weeks that followed July 20th revealed the conspiracy's true extent and exposed the depth of Hitler's paranoid fury. Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben was arrested on July 21st. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, former chief of military intelligence who had long protected anti-Nazi conspirators, was taken into custody. General Erich Höppner, General Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel, military governor of France who had actually succeeded in arresting the SS in Paris before the coup's failure, and dozens of other senior officers were rounded up. Hitler's instructions to the Gestapo and the newly appointed investigative commission under SS Obergruppenführer Ernst Kaltenbrunner were explicit. The investigation was to be ruthless, thorough, and unrestrained by any legal niceties. "I want them hanged like cattle," Hitler ordered. The trials, held before the Volksgerichtshof, People's Court, under the fanatical Nazi judge Roland Freisler, were designed as spectacles of humiliation. Defendants were denied belts and suspenders, forced to hold up their trousers as Freisler screamed abuse at them. The proceedings were filmed on Hitler's orders. He watched the footage repeatedly in the weeks that followed, taking particular satisfaction in the defendants' degradation. Field Marshal von Witzleben, gaunt and broken after weeks of Gestapo interrogation, was forced to stand before Freisler clutching his trousers. When he attempted to speak in his defence, Freisler shouted him down. "You dirty old man, why do you keep fumbling with your trousers?" The executions were carried out at Plötzensee prison, using methods deliberately chosen for their cruelty. On Hitler's specific orders, the condemned were hanged not by the standard drop method that broke the neck, but by slow strangulation using thin piano wire attached to meat hooks. The process could take 20 minutes or more. These executions too were filmed, and Hitler reportedly watched them with satisfaction. General Helmuth Stief, who had stored the explosives used in the bomb, hanged. General Paul von Hase, Berlin city commandant, hanged. Colonel General Erich Höppner, hanged. The executions continued for months, extending into 1945. The policy of Sippenhaft, collective punishment of families, was applied with unprecedented rigour. Wives, children, parents, and siblings of conspirators were arrested, sent to concentration camps, or simply disappeared. The Stauffenberg family name was ordered erased from German records. Children of conspirators were taken from their families and given new identities. The assassination attempt and its aftermath transformed Hitler in ways that accelerated Germany's destruction. His always present suspicion of the military officer corps metastasized into pathological distrust. His health, already declining, deteriorated rapidly. The tremor in his left hand, barely noticeable before July 20th, became pronounced. He walked with a shuffle. His decisions became increasingly erratic. Field Marshal Keitel, attending briefings in the weeks after the attempt, noted that Hitler now questioned every report, every recommendation, every piece of intelligence. "He trusts no one now," Keitel recorded. "Every general is suspect, every staff officer a potential traitor." The professional independence that had characterized the German officer corps was systematically destroyed. Hitler inserted Nazi political officers into military units. The traditional military salute was replaced with the Nazi raised arm salute. Officers were required to demonstrate ideological loyalty, not merely professional competence. General Heinz Guderian, appointed Chief of the General Staff in the aftermath of July 20th, found himself working with a Supreme Commander who second-guessed every tactical decision while making strategic choices based on ideology rather than military reality. When Guderian attempted to present realistic assessments of the Eastern Front, Hitler accused him of defeatism and threatened him with arrest. The conspirators had hoped that killing Hitler would allow Germany to negotiate peace with the Western Allies before Soviet forces reached German soil. Their failure ensured that the war would continue for another 10 months, during which millions more would die. The Eastern Front collapsed. The Western Allies advanced through France and into Germany. Cities were reduced to rubble. The Holocaust continued to its final, terrible conclusion. The July 20th plot was the closest anyone came to killing Hitler during the war. But was it doomed from the start? Could it have succeeded? And what would have happened if Hitler had died that day? These questions have haunted historians for decades, and the answers reveal uncomfortable truths about resistance, responsibility, and the machinery of totalitarian power. In the final months of the war, as Germany collapsed around him, Hitler returned obsessively to July 20th. It had become, in his mind, both the ultimate betrayal and the ultimate vindication. The officer corps had proved itself treacherous, just as he had always suspected, but Providence had protected him, confirming his special destiny. "If I had died on July 20th, he told his secretaries in the Berlin bunker, history would have blamed the generals for losing the war. Now they cannot escape their share of the guilt. They will be condemned alongside me." The conspiracy, paradoxically, strengthened Hitler's grip on power even as it revealed how hollow that power had become. Officers who might have resisted his increasingly irrational orders now feared accusation of disloyalty. The terror unleashed after July 20th silenced dissent and ensured that Germany would fight to absolute destruction rather than seek a negotiated end. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet shells fell on the Reich Chancellery Garden, Hitler finally succeeded where Stauffenberg had failed. The bullet that ended his life in the Führer bunker accomplished what the briefcase bomb had not. Field Marshal Keitel, who had stood beside Hitler through the July 20th explosion and remained loyal to the end, was captured by Allied forces and tried at Nuremberg. Asked about the conspiracy, he offered a judgment that revealed more than he perhaps intended. They were brave men who did what they believed was right, but they waited too long, and they trusted too much in plans that required everything to go perfectly. Nothing ever goes perfectly in war. Claus von Stauffenberg, whose courage in walking into that conference room with a bomb in his briefcase has become legendary, had understood something that many of his fellow conspirators did not. He knew the chances of success were slim. He knew he would likely die regardless of the outcome. But he acted anyway, because the attempt itself mattered. Because history would remember that not all Germans followed Hitler willingly, that some risked everything to stop the madness. In the courtyard of the Bendler block where Stauffenberg fell before the firing squad, a memorial now stands. The inscription reads simply, "Here died for Germany." Whether those men died for the Germany that was, the Germany that might have been, or the Germany that eventually emerged from the ashes of Hitler's Reich, remains a question that each generation must answer for itself. But on that summer afternoon in 1944, when Hitler emerged from the wreckage of the conference barracks and learned that his own generals had tried to kill him, he glimpsed a truth he could never fully accept, that the empire he had built on loyalty and fear was hollow at its core, sustained not by devotion but by terror, and destined to collapse the moment that terror faltered. The bomb that failed to kill Hitler revealed the rot within the Reich more surely than any Allied victory. And the purge that followed, the hangings, the show trials, the family arrests, the piano wire and meat hooks, revealed the nature of the regime more clearly than any propaganda could obscure. July 20th, 1944, the day Hitler learned his generals were plotting against him, was not the end of the Third Reich, but it was the moment when the Reich's end became inevitable, locked into a trajectory of destruction from which there could be no escape. If you found this story compelling, subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from World War II. Every week we explore the moments that shaped history, the decisions, the betrayals, and the acts of courage that determined the fate of nations. Click the bell icon to be notified when new videos are released.